Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Gaming with me, Tony Mo, and we're here today with another episode of Battles of World War I. You asked for it. Tony, when is it coming? Tony, where's the next episode of Battles of World War I? Well, it's here today, right now, and we're going to be taking a look at the Battle of the Somme, also known as the Somme Offensive. It was a World War I battle fought by the British and French empires against the German Empire. It would take place from July 1st to November 18th, 1916. It was one of the largest battles of World War I on the Western Front, and it would take place on both sides of the upper reaches of the River Somme in France. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to focus on the Battle of Somme, apart from the fact that it was also one of the bloodiest battles in human history, was because it was the introduction, of the first time that we would see a tank used in war, deployed into the war by the British Army. And we'll talk about that after we go through sort of the overall recap of the Battle of Somme itself. So look forward to that. As I said, guys, this was one of the bloodiest battles in human history, not just in World War I. More than 1 million men would be wounded or killed. Ridiculous numbers. Absolutely ridiculous numbers. Don't even really want to think about it any more than that. Now, the whole sort of setup and plan behind the Somme offensive started with Allied discussions in Chantilly-Oise. Happened on December 1915. The Allies would sit down and agree upon a combined offensive against the Central Powers that would take place in 1916. This would include French, Russian, British, and Italian armies. The Somme offensive would be the Franco-British contribution to this overall strategy. Now, the initial plan would have the French army leading the main portion of the Somme offensive while supported by the 4th Army of the British Expeditionary Force. However, plans would not remain the same leading up to the battle itself, as the German Imperial Army would begin the Battle of Verdun on February 21st, 1916. A lot of you guys familiar with the Battle of Verdun, of course, one of the few, or if not possibly only, World War I battles to have a video game made after it. This would lead the French command to divert a large number of its forces originally intended for the Somme offensive to Verdun. And the British would then find themselves no longer just supporting the attack effort at Somme, but helping directly lead it. So the tables had completely turned for the British, who, by the way, many of the members of the Allied forces during World War I and the Battle of Somme were undersupplied. Like, the more you read into detail about World War I, the more you realize just how much of it was, like, absolutely down to the bare bone, man. Like, last bits of supplies, and, like, you know, while there were a lot of insane developments like the tanks because of some of these issues, like trench warfare, it's just all crazy, man. Crazy. But let's move forward. So let's talk day one. Day one on the Somme would take place on July 1st and would see a serious defeat for the German Second Army. They would end up being forced out of their position by the French 6th Army, moving from Foucault in Saintar to Maricourt on the north bank. They would then be moved further from Maricourt to the area near Albert-Bapaume Road by the 4th Army. So looking good, right? Well, not so much, because as it turns out, day one would also be the worst day in the history of the British Army, with over 57,000 casualties, of nearly 20,000 of them deaths. Few British troops would end up reaching the German front line. Now let's talk a little bit about the British troops themselves. They were actually made up of a mixture of the remains of the pre-war regular army, what would be called the territorial forces, and the Kitchener Army. So the regular army, or the standing army, is simply their traditional army. They don't disband during times of peace, so on and so forth. They are, you know, ready to go. They are trained and ready to rock and roll. The territorial army would be the volunteer or reserve component of the British Army. It existed from 1908 until 1920. Now, shortly after the end of the First World War, it would be reformed and renamed the Territorial Army, which today is now known as the Army Reserves. Kitchener's army is probably the most interesting element of this composition. It was an all-volunteer army formed on the recommendation of one Horatio Kitchener. Horatio Kitchener himself was one of the few people who did not follow popular belief that the war would be short and over by Christmas of 1914. In fact, he recognized that it would be long and bloody, which sadly it would end up being long and bloody, unfortunately. So interesting bit there, you know, regarding all of those elements. Kitchener himself believed, because of his beliefs that the war would be long and bloody, that, a volunteer army would be necessary to increase the chance of success in battle. Like, damn. You know, like, you have that blending, right? You have the volunteer reserve component, which, yeah, is going to be trained, and you have an all-volunteer army that probably saw a next to no training, that, you know, had extremely limited supplies. In fact, they were also despairingly referred to as Kitchener's Mob. The crazy thing, too, was the original intention was to form this army and then have them ready to be put into action in 1917. So as I mentioned, you know, the idea was that they would train them. You know, they were going to. There was plans to train them. However, things, you know, would change, and circumstances would then end up forcing them into battle in 1915. So 2 years before, during the Battle of Loos in September and October of 1915. So, yeah. You can see how that all went down. Not very well, let's just put it that way. Moving forward, though, let's kind of wrap it up. The Battle of Somme is actually a very complex battle to talk about. If you actually want to sit here and talk about every single element of it, we'd probably be here for 2 hours, which some of you might enjoy. But the fact is, it was made up of 3 different phases, pushing all the way towards its end in November 1916. It was made up of more than a dozen battles, you know, ranging from the first day on the Somme all the way to the final battle of the Ancre, which would take place on November 13th to November 18th. The crazy thing, right, for me, is that, you know, technically they say the battle ended in 1916, but then winter came. So the situation right before that winter was that the British and French had penetrated 6 miles into German-occupied territory. The Anglo-French armies would end up failing to capture Peronne. I can't do the French pronunciation. I looked it up. It's hard, guys. It's not easy. Kudos to anyone who speaks French. And would be halted just near Bapaume, where the Germans would maintain their position over winter. And this is what I'm saying. Winter goes, everybody kind of hunkers down. The winter goes, they all endure it. They just focus on, you know, surviving a winter, probably with very few supplies. They definitely don't have, obviously, the equipment that we have today to survive something like a freezing cold winter. And then 1917 comes around and the British resume attacking. And they force the Germans into reserve lines just before their scheduled return to the Hindenburg Line in March. Crazy. Now, the Hindenburg Line was, it was a German defensive position. It was basically a precaution as they saw it. But again, they would end up using it to sort of fall back after the attacks by the British Army in the Ancre Valley. And that's kind of it, you know? I think the hardest thing to find is any sort of, like, okay, well, what did this do for the war? And the reality is, even today, this whole sort of purpose, the aftermath of the Battle of the Somme is analyzed deeply by historical teachers and you know, figures, however you want to call it. You know, people look at it and they question it. In fact, you know, just towards the end of it, August 1916, Winston Churchill himself was questioning it. He objected to the way the battle was fought. Lord George, Prime Minister, would criticize the attrition warfare and would eventually condemn the battle in his post-war memoirs. You know, when you look at the casualties on all sides, like, people just sit there and they say to themselves, why? You know, why launch this offensive? What did it actually do in the end? Now, I have no real historical experience. I'm not some of a historical, you know, teacher. Like, I don't do this sort of thing. I'm not about to sit here and try and analyze all that, but I think it's very interesting, you know, the way so many people have looked at this, you know. It's a very interesting war in that respect. This is the type of battle, I should say. Of course, the war itself was very interesting in that respect as well. And it's the kind of thing where I would love to talk to somebody, you know, who's seriously into the, you know, the deep research of it, like a actual historian who spent their life analyzing something like this, because I can only imagine, you know, the theories and the thoughts they would have regarding the different situations. And that's not an easy thing to do, you know, to look back at something. And I imagine it wasn't easy then, even for someone like, you know, Churchill or Lloyd George, to look back and, you know, to analyze it. I especially imagine the amount of, you know, anger and just the feelings, the emotions that you have to have when you look at the losses. And let's just kind of recap on that. As I said, you know, nearly 1 million. So it'd be 419,654 British, 202,567 French. To the Germans, 465,181. Now, up until the 1930s, the popular view of the battle, as it was written in the English language, was that the battle was a hard-fought victory against a brave and experienced and well-led opponent. That's, one really just blanket way to look at the whole, the whole sort of thing. But as I said, people today are still analyzing the battle, its significance, and whether or not it was just a massive, pointless loss of a hell of a lot of life. Brutal. And at the end of the day, I think that happens often when we look at war and we look at battles that occurred during wars. There's often questions as to, their purpose. And if they didn't directly influence the success of the war itself or the outcome of the war, a lot of people tend to question it. So let's talk about tanks. Let's get off the subject and let's talk about something a little more cheerful. Not really, but let's talk about tanks. So as I said, this was a battle that very much focused on air power and, of course, the introduction of the tank by the British. So the Mark I tank, as it would known, would be first used in combat by the British Army September 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. Now, the name tank was adopted by the British during the early stages of the tank's development. It was used as a security measure to conceal their purpose. They didn't want anyone to know what they were doing, and they would end up being very successful in that, as we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, the French and British would both develop and build tanks, thousands of them in World War I. Germany, though, would remain unconvinced of the tank's potential and only build 20. Now, completely uneducated bit of speculation here by me. It's interesting because when we look at tank development during World War II, no doubt that all sides, all factions involved in World War II developed tanks in one way or another. Very successful tanks. But one of the things that you always hear about German tanks, is that the lack of reliability for some of the tanks. Yes, they were powerful, but the Germans could barely keep them running, especially when we talk about the Tiger tank. And you wonder, that lack of R&D during World War I, how much of that would, lend to the unreliability of German tanks in World War II. Just an interesting thought. Figured I'd throw it in there. So I wanted to talk further about this Mark I tank because I had a lot of fun actually looking at the Mark I tank. I've seen images of it and I'm familiar with it, but I've never actually sat down to kind of look at how did the armor work, how did all of these things kind of go about. So the big thing about the Mark I tank was that it was, it got the job done. Let's just put it that way. And I think the first place that we can start having a bit of discussion here is with the protection issue, essentially the tank's armor. So the tank would have 8mm or 0.31 inch plates, which were proven to be bulletproof. However, each impact would produce mini shrapnel inside the hull that would injure anyone inside. And they didn't know about this until they took it into battle. So after the first reports, they would fit the crewmen with thick leather jackets and helmets, or a combination of leather and chainmail. What? So the spale liners, which would eventually deal with the issue, would take ages to even come into development. What? Yeah. That's rough, man. I can't even fathom it. The whole idea of being inside of a tank to me in general is both cool and ridiculous. You had to be a different type of person. And one of the things you constantly hear, whether it was World War I or World War II, anytime that a tank was used, during the early days, you always hear stories of how the crewmen of the tanks were a bit out there. They were a bit strange. Now, this may have been caused by the fact that they were constantly being made sick. So, number one, tanks were incredibly loud. They reeked, and the temperatures could reach nearly 50 degrees Celsius, which is close to unbearable. There were huge amounts of emissions of carbon monoxide, cordite, fuel, and oil vapors. The tanks themselves had incredibly poor ventilation, and there was just a narrow door that was situated behind the sponson where they would try and get fresh air in. And that would not actually work. Now, when they first went out in the Mark I tank, there was very little training to be done with the tanks themselves. They were produced, okay, here we go, very little battlefield training. And so there had to be this level of internal communication, right? That's the whole point of a tank, is you have the guy doing the driving, the guy doing the gunning. They have to be able to communicate with one another. And essentially, they wouldn't be able to do this. This would be incredibly difficult. The steering components themselves would be incredibly challenging, and all of these things would lead to exceptional mechanical stress. which would cause to the extreme lack of reliability for these things. There'd be so many breakdowns due to this stress that was essentially tied to both, you know, mechanical issues with the tank, but also just communication and actual usage issues of the crews because they had no real experience with something that had pretty much just been developed. Insane, man. That's all I gotta say, is absolutely insane. And there's some pretty cool stuff. If you guys actually look around on YouTube, you can find some footage of, you know, from 1916 actually, of the Mark I tanks at 2 miles an hour. 2 miles an hour was their speed. They had a range of 27.9 miles or 45 kilometers. What? 6 people in this thing, like, crazy, man. Absolutely insane, you know. I think that's one of the things I enjoy most, you know, when I look back at history and stuff, are a lot of the men who were in these sorts of machines, you know, like the Mark I tank, you know, the early bombers and things like that, and it just craziness. So let's actually, I have a sort of eyewitness encounter of one of the tanks that was, or of a tank being seen for the first time on a battlefield in 1916. So this is Bert Cheney's encounter, and we're going to read this. It's pretty lengthy. I'm just going to sit here and kind of narrate the whole thing for you guys because I find it to be very interesting. There's quite a bit more to it, and as always, if you guys want to click down in the description, you'll see the full list of annotations and citations, and you can check out all of this stuff in your own time if you want to read a little bit deeper. So this is after the tanks have already arrived, and this is Bert Cheney's sort of perspective and a bit of a story as to what was happening. It was most heartening to watch their advance. We were almost ready to cheer. But there was a surprise in store for us. Instead of going on to the German lines, the 3 tanks assigned to us straddled our front line, stopped, and then opened up murderous machine gun fire. Everyone dived for cover, except the colonel. He jumped on top of the parapet, shouting at the top of his voice, "Runner, runner! Go tell those tanks to stop firing at once, I say!" By now, the enemy fire had risen to a crescendo. But given no thought to his personal safety, as he saw the tanks fire on his own men, he ran forward and furiously rained blows with his cane on the side of one of the tanks in an endeavor to attract their attention. Although, with the sounds of the engine and the firing in such an enclosed space, no one in the tank could hear him. They did finally realize they were on the wrong trench and moved on. Now, he goes on to say eventually the tanks would take damage from the battle. One of their tracks would be essentially destroyed. Another tank would make it a little bit further, basically just plowing on blindly with no stealing, seeing how far they could get, and another tank would actually break through a wall and make it into what was the German defensive line right there. Now, the one tank that had broken down right in front of them on the trench, interesting bit of story here. So the crewmen get out of the tank, they start to walk around, look at it, you know, hitting it like, ah, shucks. After a few more minutes of standing around, looking somewhat lost, he says, they calmly took out from the inside of their tank a Primus stove and using the side of the tank as cover from enemy fire, sat down on the ground and made themselves some tea. The battle was over as far as they were concerned. And this is what I talked about earlier when I said, you know, how a lot of the stories behind the tank crews were very eccentric. Well, that's it for us. You know, we don't really have any firearms, and our tank is done, so we're just gonna have a cup of tea. Good luck, mates. And they called it a day, and that was it for them. How wonderful. How wonderful, disturbing, but how wonderful. And it reminds me, I don't know if you guys are familiar with a film called Kelly's Heroes. It actually is a World War II film with Clint Eastwood. Not really, you know, based on any sort of historical accuracy, but Donald Sutherland, Kiefer Sutherland's dad, plays a tank driver, you know, driver of a Sherman tank. And they're very eccentric. They're almost hippies, you know, and they play loud music when they go into battle to scare the enemy. And I love that whole sort of, you know, portrayal they have of the tank. You know, they even talk about putting different, they took like barrels off of larger tanks and they put it over the Sherman tank so the Germans think that they have a larger main gun. You know, that's something they would talk about, and I believe that was a legitimate strategy that they would actually use. You know, there's a lot of crazy elements that go into, you know, the history behind tanks throughout battle. And one of the big things that I didn't really talk about here that I do want to mention was that because they were able to keep the tanks, the Mark I, such a deeply held secret, the German soldiers, you know, they had never seen something like this before. We can't really fathom that at this point in age because we've got, you know, SpaceX and rockets going to, you know, space and things like that and all these crazy bits and pieces of the technology. So it's hard for us to fathom you know, something like this being like, what the hell? And even though it's only moving 2 miles an hour, like crawling at you, it's loud, it's terrifying, it's got machine guns on it, like you're gonna run really quickly. And that's exactly what it did. Not only did it provide, you know, the actual defensive element, again, as I said, despite being very, very unreliable, breaking down, having track issues all the time. You know, that fear factor, that scare tactics was enough that it definitely assisted them in the battles where the tanks were deployed. So, quite awesome. I think it'll be fun at some point when this series is over, and we'll continue to spend some time looking at, you know, the history of military technology. And I think it'd be fun to do some research on tanks and, you know, maybe talk about a specific tank. You know, that was one of the reasons I really enjoyed playing games like War Thunder and World of Tanks, was being able to kind of get a taste of that history. So maybe that's something we'll continue in the future. I want to thank you guys for joining me once again for another episode of Battles of World War I. We're actually getting very close to seeing our first actual gameplay for Battlefield 1. I believe June 12th is when they're going to be holding the event, around the same time as E3. They've got a bunch of community YouTubers like Stone Mountain who are going to be actually playing the game with their own squads at the event. Of course, it's a public event, so if you're in London, I believe it is, you can actually go ahead at EA Play, play the game for yourself. I strongly recommend going to check it out if you're nearby. I'd say that is well worth taking the day off for. And I, of course, am very much looking forward to seeing some of Battlefield 1 for myself. Thank you guys, as I said, once again, so much for watching and joining me today for this another episode of Battles of World War I. Look forward to more episodes in the future, and I will see you in the next one.